In early spring of 1831, the town of Brackenridge, a quiet settlement in central Pennsylvania, recorded its most controversial institutional death to date. Silas Creed, confined for 5 years to the state's lesser-known private asylum system, died following an emergency transfer whose medical records vanished within days. No burial permit was issued, no physician signed the cause of death. What remains are administrative letters, fragments of testimony, and a 48-hour logbook whose final entries defy conventional medical interpretation. Established in 1822, the Brackenridge Institute of Behavioral Reform presented itself as a progressive facility committed to humane treatment and early intervention science. Public demonstrations of moral balancing and controlled stimulus therapy made it a regional model for other private institutions. Its clientele included both the impoverished and the elite, drawn by promises of discretion and innovation. However, internal audits withheld from state review and the absence of patient discharge records would later raise questions about the true nature of its operations. For Silas Creed, admitted without criminal charge but under private court order, the facility offered neither reform nor release. The Brackenridge Institute of Behavioral Reform opened its doors in July 1822 on the perimeter of a farming district west of Harrisburg. Set on 30 acres once earmarked for a Quaker agricultural retreat, the property had been quietly purchased through a private endowment arranged by Dr. Harmon Edel, a physician previously employed by the State Infirmary of Philadelphia. Edel's published writings emphasized restraint alternatives and mental conditioning based on dietary and atmospheric variables. This theory, though rarely endorsed in medical circles, found support among rural gentry eager to finance institutions outside the public health system. By 1825, the institute housed nearly 60 residents, most admitted through family petition or discreet legal arrangement. The institute's charter allowed for indefinite detention under judicial seal, provided that periodic assessments were conducted and documented by a medical review board composed of 2 physicians and a court-appointed observer. In practice, records indicate that these reviews occurred infrequently and without witness. The main building, constructed in Georgian style with iron-shuttered dormitories and a sealed central observatory, stood 3 stories high. Its east wing was restricted from public tours and absent from floor plans. Visitors were escorted through the west reception area and therapy annex, where glass windows, natural light, and parlor seating created an impression of peace and civility. Local magistrates and landowners were occasionally invited to observe behavioral experiments involving timed tasks and color-sound response trials. What lay beyond these curated zones was rarely discussed outside the staff's own written correspondence. The staff itself was composed primarily of unmarried women, trained in convent facilities, and male attendants transferred from maritime detention ships. Monthly payrolls were signed by Dr. Edel and confirmed by one of the founding trustees, a merchant named Elias Wren, whose involvement in institute operations would intensify after the death of Edel's wife in 1827. That same year, an internal communication submitted to the Brackenridge County Registrar flagged inconsistencies in staff rosters. Specifically, 2 attendants and 1 kitchen laborer were listed as discharged in April 1826, but were still receiving food allotments into late autumn. A formal audit was not conducted. The documentation was archived under logistical error and reassigned to supply chain corrections. By the turn of 1830, the facility had begun recording its residents not by name, but by numerical designation, citing a new classification method adapted from a treatment trial in Ghent. Silas Creed was entered under Code 43B, male, age bracket 20 to 25, origin, unnamed parish, intake status, private order. No medical notes were attached to his entry. A ledger notation dated May 19, 1826, confirmed only that he had arrived under sealed recommendation from a family representative. Silas's first appearance in internal documentation occurred 7 months later, in the December 1826 log of experimental observations. Entry 43B is noted as demonstrating irregular resistance to both isolation protocols and sound field calibration sessions. While most residents reacted with measurable fatigue to scheduled auditory exposure intervals, Subject 43B continued to respond with steady-state pacing and showed no recorded decline in ocular responsiveness. Staff notes from this period are inconsistent. In one entry from January 1827, an observer described the subjects non-reactive to known mnemonic stimuli. In another, dated less than 3 days later, the same staff member noted the subject fully replicated assigned motion sequences without cue. These contradictions were not addressed in quarterly summaries. It was not until the summer of 1828 that Creed's designation was altered from Code 43B to Status H. This marked the first recorded departure from standard labeling protocols. The exact criteria for this change were not detailed in the accompanying entry, but it coincided with a memorandum from Dr. Edel requesting all high-variance profiles be monitored using the upper gallery rotation system. This system, a little-known architectural feature, allowed certain residents to be rotated through observation chambers without direct staff interaction. The rotating room structures were designed to reduce contact variables, but maintenance logs show that several units failed to align properly, causing temporary lock-ins lasting several hours. According to the 1829 internal briefing submitted to the Institute's silent partners, there had been 3 status escalations requiring night watch override. These events were not elaborated upon, but were grouped within a section titled Forecast Risks and Mitigation. Among the names listed in that section, Silas Creed's was the only one not redacted. Throughout this period, public interest in the Institute remained stable. Brackenridge locals described the facility as an innovative site removed from urban failures and corruption. With no criminal incidents tied to the Institute and a continued presence at local medical fairs, it maintained a favorable position among county administrators. The Quarterly Review of Rehabilitative Science, published under regional medical auspices, printed a full-page profile on Dr. Edel in early 1830, referring to his work as a prelude to rational order in behavioral science. What the profile omitted were the inquiries already underway regarding missing family contacts. Between 1828 and 1830, at least 5 separate parties filed requests with county offices seeking the status of relatives reportedly admitted to the Institute, but no longer acknowledged in correspondence. These inquiries, channeled through clerical intermediaries, were marked as pending and did not trigger judicial inspection. The Institute retained its exemption from routine search, protected under its private funding charter, and the absence of criminal liability. Creed's log entries throughout late 1830 shifted from analytical to irregular. Observations from October to December contained fewer behavioral notes and more time markers. One entry recorded that Creed stood immobile for 4 full hours during a seasonal temperature drop, without request for blanket or relocation. Another noted that his pulse was documented at 34 per minute, despite concurrent entries showing him completing stair descent trials without fatigue. No adjustments to diet, schedule, or medication were recorded during this time. He continued to be assigned to Room 7C East Gallery within the sealed wing. Only staff with Level 3 clearance, as designated in the 1831 protocol chart, had access to this quadrant. In March 1831, a brief directive issued by Acting Director Wren called for full immobilization and final monitoring phase of Creed. The directive gave no reason and did not cite medical authority. A reply memorandum from the Institute's legal clerk, dated 1 day later, noted that the action was within procedural scope given non-responder status and persistent aberrational loop. This phrase, aberrational loop, appeared nowhere else in the Institute's documentation and was not defined in any attached appendix. The final week of records leading to Creed's death begins with this term and proceeds with timestamps rather than interpretive language. At no point during the final 48 hours did a physician sign off on Creed's condition or note deterioration. The record simply ends. On the morning of April 2, 1831, the East Quadrant Registry logged a coded activity under Series K7, a designation reserved for unplanned access operations involving internal transfer without notice to external entities. The individual recorded under this operation was identified only as H1. Subsequent annotations in the log, penned by 3 separate staff members across different shifts, varied in tone and clarity. One noted, "completion of auditory null protocol," and another described the unit reconditioned for vacancy. No mention was made of transport route, attending physician, or final disposition. Meanwhile, correspondence from the same week revealed that Dr. Edel, although still formally listed as Director Emeritus, had not been seen at the facility since mid-March. A letter from his personal aide to a supply vendor in Reading referenced a leave of absence due to administrative exhaustion, but made no mention of Creed or the Institute's status. By April 5th, Acting Director Wren had assumed full operational control. His leadership marked a distinct procedural shift, most notably in the removal of personal identifiers from all resident files. Internal maps of resident movement were replaced with grid codes and timed pulse notations. On April 7th, a formal request was sent to the local postal authority, instructing them to reroute all incoming letters referencing Creed or Entry 43B to the legal offices of Elias Wren and Company, located off-site. The Institute's in-house courier system was adjusted to reflect these changes, and a substitute clerk was assigned to monitor all non-official correspondence. These adjustments were made without explanation to staff or families. 2 days later, a requisition form bearing Wren's signature ordered the permanent closure of Gallery 7's top floor. Although the reason was listed as architectural fatigue due to moisture intrusion, there had been no previous complaints of such damage. The accompanying structural report was not submitted, and the closure proceeded without oversight from county inspectors. Doors were sealed with archival-grade brass locks, and a new alarm rigging was installed. Visitors to the Institute after this point noted a sharp decline in visible activity within the eastern wings. Within days, key logs used by upper gallery personnel showed inconsistencies. Several entries attributed to the night shift bore timestamps that conflicted with lantern logs for the corresponding hallways. In one case, a single staff member was recorded as present on both east and west duty stations simultaneously. A handwritten correction was later inserted, but was not initialed. These irregularities continued until April 15th, after which logs resumed standard formatting. No explanation was offered in internal reports. That same week, 2 board members quietly withdrew their funding commitments. Letters of withdrawal cited overextension of institutional mandate and lack of compliance clarity. Neither letter referenced Silas Creed directly, but both documents were filed within the same ledger that contained his final weekly log entries. The ledger itself had not been updated since April 8th. Following the funding withdrawals, a cost control directive was issued, instructing all departments to reduce supply consumption by 20%. Staffing hours were revised accordingly, and nighttime monitoring was reduced to 2 individuals per wing. The Brackenridge Public Registry recorded no official deaths during the month of April 1831. Nonetheless, county sanitation logs show that on the evening of April 11th, an unidentified container was delivered from the Institute to a quarantine disposal site 20 miles west. The container's dimensions match the specifications of medical transport units used for institutional waste. No listing of contents was filed, but accompanying carriage records indicate the trip occurred at 3:20 a.m. without escort. Witness statements from the disposal site mention the driver declining to sign release documentation, citing limited authority. The container was incinerated without examination. Meanwhile, the Brackenridge Institute continued its public operations uninterrupted. On April 17th, the facility hosted a scheduled demonstration for visiting clergy and educators from 3 neighboring counties. The presentation, titled Restorative Logic and the Calibration of Thought, included a series of exercises conducted by 4 selected residents under staff supervision. None of the participants had been documented in prior logs. Their identities were assigned pseudonyms during the event, and questions from attendees were filtered through an appointed liaison. Demonstration notes later filed with the county made no mention of Creed or the Eastern Wing. Within internal planning documents, references to Creed ceased entirely after April 12th. The final document to feature his designation was a transportation routing chart, partially redacted, dated April 9th. It outlined a corridor sequence from Room 7C to Holding 3 without indicating destination. Notably, the corridor was marked time-locked, a designation typically used for segments under controlled delay, allowing for staff repositioning. According to maintenance files, this sequence had not been activated since 1829. In May 1831, one of the Institute's junior staff members filed a notice of resignation. The letter, submitted under seal to the County Review Board, mentioned procedural inconsistencies and lack of institutional transparency. While the letter avoided naming individuals, the timing and its attachment to operational records raised quiet concern among county auditors. A subsequent attempt to contact the former staff member was unsuccessful. No forwarding address was provided. By mid-June, the remaining documentation related to Creed had been transferred to the off-site storage facility maintained by Wren's legal office. The Institute itself entered a phase of internal realignment. New resident intake forms replaced individual profiles with color-coded bands, and personal interviews were discontinued in favor of standardized compatibility tests. Medical practitioners affiliated with the Institute were instructed to submit all recommendations anonymously through coded channels. Among the more peculiar outcomes of this transition was the reclassification of Eastern Wing history. In the Institute's official report to the county filed in July 1831, the structure's second and third levels were omitted from the inventory. Instead, the building was described as comprising two main levels, with archival access platforms above. When county officials inquired about the change, the Institute responded with a general statement about architectural re-evaluation. Over the next several months, public curiosity about the Institute declined. No further demonstrations were held that year, and the only external communication came in the form of a revised mission statement distributed to select donors. The statement emphasized discretion, regulation, and alignment with non-carceral reform models. Its language closely mirrored that of Wren's personal letters archived during this period. Meanwhile, any references to Creed in state records, health registries, or census materials gradually ceased. Though his intake was formally documented in 1826, no record of discharge, transfer, or burial was ever filed. Staff who had worked directly with the Eastern Quadrant during his residency were reassigned or no longer present by the start of 1832. Room 7C was not mentioned in any institutional materials produced after April 1831. Later reviews of the Brackenridge Institute's early years often omitted Creed entirely. When mentioned, he was referred to in abstract terms, typically as part of broader discussions on classification failure or data deviation. His case, if acknowledged, was presented as anomalous and lacking sufficient evidentiary support for review. No internal inquiry was reopened, and no family members came forward after the initial postal redirection. Creed's absence from post-1831 records remains consistent across all known archives related to the Institute. Whether his presence was systematically removed or simply neglected by subsequent staff remains unresolved. The institutional framework that recorded his intake was no longer in place by the mid-1830s. What remained was a structural silence, one supported by administrative reform and the elimination of individual designation in favor of coded standardization. On the morning of April 2, 1831, the East Quadrant Registry logged a coded activity under Series K7, a designation reserved for unplanned access operations involving internal transfer without notice to external entities. The individual recorded under this operation was identified only as H1. Subsequent annotations in the log, penned by 3 separate staff members across different shifts, varied in tone and clarity. One noted completion of auditory null protocol, and another described the unit reconditioned for vacancy. No mention was made of transport route, attending physician, or final disposition. Meanwhile, correspondence from the same week revealed that Dr. Edel, although still formally listed as Director Emeritus, had not been seen at the facility since mid-March. A letter from his personal aide to a supply vendor in Reading referenced a leave of absence due to administrative exhaustion, but made no mention of Creed or the Institute's status. By April 5th, Acting Director Wren had assumed full operational control. His leadership marked a distinct procedural shift, most notably in the removal of personal identifiers from all resident files. Internal maps of resident movement were replaced with grid codes and timed pulse notations. On April 7th, a formal request was sent to the local postal authority, instructing them to reroute all incoming letters referencing Creed or Entry 43B to the legal offices of Elias Wren and Company, located off-site. The Institute's in-house courier system was adjusted to reflect these changes, and a substitute clerk was assigned to monitor all non-official correspondence. These adjustments were made without explanation to staff or families. 2 days later, a requisition form bearing Wren's signature ordered the permanent closure of Gallery 7's top floor. Although the reason was listed as architectural fatigue due to moisture intrusion, there had been no previous complaints of such damage. The accompanying structural report was not submitted, and the closure proceeded without oversight from county inspectors. Doors were sealed with archival-grade brass locks, and a new alarm rigging was installed. Visitors to the Institute after this point noted a sharp decline in visible activity within the eastern wings. Within days, key logs used by upper gallery personnel showed inconsistencies. Several entries attributed to the night shift bore timestamps that conflicted with lantern logs for the corresponding hallways. In one case, a single staff member was recorded as present on both East and West duty stations simultaneously. A handwritten correction was later inserted, but was not initialed. These irregularities continued until April 15th, after which logs resumed standard formatting. No explanation was offered in internal reports. That same week, 2 board members quietly withdrew their funding commitments. Letters of withdrawal cited overextension of institutional mandate and lack of compliance clarity. Neither letter referenced Silas Creed directly, but both documents were filed within the same ledger that contained his final weekly log entries. The ledger itself had not been updated since April 8th. Following the funding withdrawals, a cost control directive was issued, instructing all departments to reduce supply consumption by 20%. Staffing hours were revised accordingly, and nighttime monitoring was reduced to 2 individuals per wing. The Brackenridge Public Registry recorded no official deaths during the month of April 1831. Nonetheless, county sanitation logs show that on the evening of April 11th, an unidentified container was delivered from the Institute to a quarantine disposal site 20 miles west. The container's dimensions matched the specifications of medical transport units used for institutional waste. No listing of contents was filed, but accompanying carriage records indicate the trip occurred at 3:20 a.m. without escort. Witness statements from the disposal site mention the driver declining to sign release documentation, citing limited authority. The container was incinerated without examination. Meanwhile, the Brackenridge Institute continued its public operations uninterrupted. On April 17th, the facility hosted a scheduled demonstration for visiting clergy and educators from 3 neighboring counties. The presentation, titled Restorative Logic and the Calibration of Thought, included a series of exercises conducted by 4 selected residents under staff supervision. None of the participants had been documented in prior logs. Their identities were assigned pseudonyms during the event, and questions from attendees were filtered through an appointed liaison. Demonstration notes later filed with the county made no mention of Creed or the Eastern Wing. Within internal planning documents, references to Creed ceased entirely after April 12th. The final document to feature his designation was a transportation routing chart, partially redacted, dated April 9th. It outlined a corridor sequence from Room 7C to Holding 3 without indicating destination. Notably, the corridor was marked time-locked, a designation typically used for segments under controlled delay, allowing for staff repositioning. According to maintenance files, this sequence had not been activated since 1829. In May 1831, one of the Institute's junior staff members filed a notice of resignation. The letter, submitted under seal to the County Review Board, mentioned procedural inconsistencies and lack of institutional transparency. While the letter avoided naming individuals, The timing and its attachment to operational records raised quiet concern among county auditors. A subsequent attempt to contact the former staff member was unsuccessful. No forwarding address was provided. By mid-June, the remaining documentation related to Creed had been transferred to the off-site storage facility maintained by Wren's legal office. The institute itself entered a phase of internal realignment. New resident intake forms replaced individual profiles with color-coded bands, and personal interviews were discontinued in favor of standardized compatibility tests. Medical practitioners affiliated with the institute were instructed to submit all recommendations anonymously through coded channels. Among the more peculiar outcomes of this transition was the reclassification of Eastern Wing history. In the Institute's official report to the county filed in July 1831, the structure's second and third levels were omitted from the inventory. Instead, the building was described as comprising two main levels, with archival access platforms above. When county officials inquired about the change, the Institute responded with a general statement about architectural re-evaluation. Over the next several months, public curiosity about the Institute declined. No further demonstrations were held that year, and the only external communication came in the form of a revised mission statement distributed to select donors. The statement emphasized discretion, regulation, and alignment with non-carceral reform models. Its language closely mirrored that of Wren's personal letters archived during this period. Meanwhile, any references to Creed in state records, health registries, or census materials gradually ceased. Though his intake was formally documented in 1826, no record of discharge, transfer, or burial was ever filed. Staff who had worked directly with the Eastern Quadrant during his residency were reassigned or no longer present by the start of 1832. Room 7C was not mentioned in any institutional materials produced after April 1831. Later reviews of the Brackenridge Institute's early years often omitted Creed entirely. When mentioned, he was referred to in abstract terms, typically as part of broader discussions on classification failure or data deviation. His case, if acknowledged, was presented as anomalous and lacking sufficient evidentiary support for review. No internal inquiry was reopened, and no family members came forward after the initial postal redirection. Creed's absence from post-1831 records remains consistent across all known archives related to the Institute. Whether his presence was systematically removed or simply neglected by subsequent staff remains unresolved. The institutional framework that recorded his intake was no longer in place by the mid-1830s. What remained was a structural silence, one supported by administrative reform and the elimination of individual designation in favor of coded standardization. I cannot proceed with Chapter 2, Part 2 before Chapter 2. Part 1 has been generated. Please provide Chapter 2, Part 1 or instruct me to begin it. In January of 1835, nearly 4 years after the final recorded entry for Silas Creed, the Brackenridge Institute underwent an unannounced structural inspection prompted by a routine insurance renewal. While the facility had retained its operational license through a combination of private underwriting and court-sanctioned immunity, a recent policy update required documentation of full spatial compliance, including areas designated for limited access. The inspection team, contracted from an independent assessor based in Chambersburg, included a structural engineer, a fire marshal, and a records specialist. Their findings, though categorized under procedural review, introduced discrepancies that would later prompt further scrutiny. One of the first anomalies occurred within the architectural schematics submitted by the Institute. Diagrams of the East Quadrant failed to account for over 900 square feet of enclosed space. When questioned, a facility clerk attributed the discrepancy to a drafting oversight during a prior renovation. The original blueprints, however, clearly indicated a 3-room annex adjacent to Gallery 7, sealed off by an access corridor labeled D4. None of the current staff could identify this corridor, and no maintenance requests or occupancy reports had been filed for the location in over 5 years. The fire marshal's preliminary walkthrough further raised concerns. Heat distribution data from the East Quadrant showed fluctuations inconsistent with the rest of the building. Specifically, Vents servicing the sealed upper level registered high static temperatures during inactive hours. An attempt to manually inspect the ductwork was delayed due to what staff claimed was a missing key set. The inspection team documented the obstruction and flagged the report for re-entry. While the engineer proceeded with external load assessments, the records specialist began reconciling resident data with historical intake logs stored in the basement archive. A significant number of entries prior to 1831 were found to be missing from the census tally submitted annually to the county. When this was raised with Acting Director Moyer, who had succeeded Wren following the latter's sudden relocation in 1833, the explanation provided focused on prior storage damage due to humidity. Yet no evidence of mold, water leakage or decay was visible on site. Among the inconsistencies was a chart titled Conversion Cohorts, dated March 1831, which grouped several designations under symbols rather than names. The term H1 appeared in the top left corner, surrounded by phase increments and time data. None of the residents listed in this document appeared in the following year's summaries. When the specialist requested further context, the accompanying pages were no longer in the filing cabinet and were presumed misplaced. The inspection concluded with a formal recommendation to reassess spatial usage, clarify archival methodology, and submit a revised safety plan. While the Institute's operational license remained intact, the insurers applied a conditional clause mandating quarterly status updates for the East Quadrant and confirmation of its use or vacancy. The following month, the Institute submitted a brief statement certifying the full vacancy of the space and its pending conversion to a supply storage annex. Yet in the months following the inspection, subtle institutional changes suggested more than spatial reorganization. Staff with long tenures in the eastern halls were gradually reassigned to outreach units or terminated with severance. The Central Observatory, once open to public visitors during medical demonstrations, was restricted to internal use only. Its windows were fitted with light-diffusing panels, and appointments with external academics were postponed indefinitely. Simultaneously, the Institute introduced a new observational protocol described as Cycle-Adaptive Response Monitoring. This method, promoted in an internal circular, replaced the resident profile system with numeric variance scoring. According to the memo, the new system would allow staff to detect residual trace patterns from prior structural influences. No definitions were provided for these terms, and the scoring metric lacked a baseline model for comparison. One of the only surviving documents from this transitional period is a maintenance ledger labeled East Annex Deactivation, Phase 2. The log, signed intermittently between May and July 1835, lists a sequence of disassemblies involving ventilation gating, floor reinforcement removal, and sound buffering material retraction. These tasks were performed without witness certification or verification from engineering consultants. The phase concluded on July 12th with the annotation, Core Alignment Resolved. Shortly afterward, a visiting botanist from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, scheduled to evaluate the Institute's greenhouse rehabilitation program, filed an informal complaint with the county board. His letter mentioned that during his stay, he had been confined to the western wing, and was not permitted access to certain garden rows located near the former east entrance. According to his notes, staff had erected temporary fencing and posted signage indicating chemical runoff testing. He found no odor or residue consistent with chemical agents and noted in his remarks the unusual silence in the area, despite reported occupancy in adjacent rooms. His letter was filed but did not prompt investigation. The county board at that time was undergoing a review of its rural facility oversight structure and had deprioritized non-emergency correspondence. Meanwhile, the Institute quietly removed mention of the Eastern Garden from its promotional materials and redirected future horticultural inquiries to a sister facility in Lancaster County. The silence surrounding the Institute remained intact until September 1835, when a former staff administrator, Clarissa Howen, submitted a sealed affidavit to the Office of State Health Oversight. Her document, witnessed and notarized, alleged that several procedural reports from 1831 had been deliberately altered following the reassignment of administrative duties to Wren. Specifically, she cited changes in the labeling and retention of subject data, the disappearance of time-locked corridor maps, and the unexplained renumbering of restricted access points. According to her statement, Creed's designation, once recorded as 43B and later as H1, had been entirely removed from the archival resident index by late 1832. She claimed that references to the resident continued informally among staff, particularly in relation to schedule delays and maintenance anomalies within the upper gallery. Her affidavit included a floor map she claimed was copied from a restricted staff manual. The map showed an unlisted rotation chamber directly connected to room 7C. Howen's testimony was not made public. The affidavit was transferred to a sealed review docket and attached to a standing inquiry into procedural compliance at Brackenridge. No formal hearing was scheduled. When contacted for follow-up 6 months later, Howen could not be reached at her listed address. A letter returned to the State Office was marked undeliverable with no forwarding information. By late 1835, the Institute had begun the process of redrafting its institutional charter. Language referencing individual case studies, named oversight physicians, and resident outcome tracking was removed. In its place, the new charter emphasized interval methodology, environmental calibration, and generalized comportment metrics. The East Quadrant was no longer listed as a distinct structure, instead described as an auxiliary process environment not subject to resident interface. Internal staff interviews conducted as part of an unrelated training audit indicated confusion over prior designations. Several junior staff claimed never to have heard the term Creed or 43B. Others said they believed those designations were related to discontinued testing units repurposed before their employment. No staff could verify the use of Room 7C, and the facility map distributed in 1836 showed no reference to it. As the decade progressed, the Brackenridge Institute maintained its status as a private reform facility operating under compliance variants. Funding from legacy stakeholders continued, and no legal challenges materialized. County records list consistent operational filings, payroll updates, and quarterly reports, all adhering to revised format standards. No deviation or re-entry of the original designation system was attempted. By the end of 1836, the spatial anomalies noted during the insurance inspection had been corrected in documentation, with square footage revised to match on-site observations. No further mention of the annex, Corridor D4, or conversion cohorts appeared in institutional records. Creed's intake log remained missing. Room 7C no longer existed on paper. But archived ventilation schematics, if re-examined, would still trace sealed airflow patterns to a structural cavity positioned just above the original east wing foundation. In the first quarter of 1837, following the submission of updated architectural compliance records, the Brackenridge Institute received formal acknowledgement from the State Oversight Office verifying the closure of the East Quadrant as a registered residential space. This certification marked the end of any official recognition of the wing's former use. Public references to the original structure were quietly omitted from county filings, and updated tax maps showed a reduced floor plan with no trace of auxiliary containment corridors or observation chambers. Despite these administrative changes, the Institute's internal documentation reflected signs of operational tension. Meeting logs from that spring, now preserved only in fragmented transcription, reference scheduling irregularities within training groups and inconsistent return rates from assigned trial assessments. A March entry by the Institute's registrar noted a mismatch between distribution and retrieval of resident response cards during a week-long evaluation program. Though initially believed to be an accounting misstep, follow-up inquiries failed to locate the missing cards or any responsible staff acknowledgement. These discrepancies appeared to escalate following the arrival of a temporary assessment officer named Dr. Lael Griffith, assigned from the state's mobile psychiatry unit. His assignment, formally intended to review the Institute's adoption of generalized comportment metrics, became the only known instance in which a state-certified external agent was permitted independent access to Brackenridge's full archival records. His findings were never formally published, but internal correspondence filed under Record Visit March Session indicates he expressed concern regarding the removal of longitudinal data. In particular, he noted an absence of termination records for several early intake profiles, including all designations converted to symbolic identifiers in 1831. Correspondence between Griffith and State Deputy Administrator Nathaniel Rowe contains a series of notations about anomalies in Creed's file. Griffith's inquiry, dated March 24th, referenced code elimination without corresponding transfer notice, and archival rerouting consistent with off-site burial but without municipal verification. Rowe's reply, while courteous, redirected the concern to facility-level jurisdiction, emphasizing Brackenridge's chartered independence and historical non-reliance on county certification procedures. No follow-up was recorded. By mid-1837, Griffith's assignment concluded without formal action. His report, preserved only in abstract form, acknowledged the Institute's compliance with basic procedural metrics, but cited limitations in data transparency and the need for a revised archival access framework. In subsequent correspondence, he recommended future visits include two-person verification and the use of independent intake tagging to prevent subject trace dispersion. This language, not standard in reform documentation, suggested a level of uncertainty regarding the fate of Creed and other non-retired profiles. Following Griffith's departure, the Institute began the process of revising its internal terminology once more. The term resident was replaced by candidate, and all former reference to individualized adjustment was replaced with population-level calibration data. Training logs were adapted to include outcome projection graphs rather than behavior summaries. Personal notebooks maintained by staff were discontinued, replaced by rotating task sheets submitted daily to a central record keeper. These new protocols coincided with the decommissioning of legacy file drawers in the Northern Archive Room. Among the final entries logged in the archive disposal ledger was a bundled file marked Experimental Case Records, 1826-1831. No details were included beyond the intake years. The disposal method listed was thermal neutralization at a remote facility unaffiliated with the Institute. Transport of these records was executed on May 2nd by an external carrier not listed in previous service contracts. Despite the effort to finalize this administrative transition, small inconsistencies continued to appear in incidental documents. A supply request form filed by Grounds Maintenance in June 1837 listed the need for 5 locking mechanisms to replace failed fixtures on the eastern door frames. The request was denied on the grounds that no such doors existed. However, further correspondence from the same department the following week described a delay in clearing overgrowth around unaccessed south-facing threshold, later determined to be a misidentified storage access tunnel. In August of the same year, a weatherproofing contractor from Philadelphia visited the site to inspect exterior masonry. During his assessment, he photographed the perimeter wall surrounding the area formerly known as Gallery 7. His records, retained as part of his business account, captured a sealed iron latch embedded within a false facade segment. The latch bore no identifier but appeared designed for regular access. When presented with this image by a county liaison reviewing building improvements, the Institute responded that the object was a decorative reinforcement element and not functional. Later that fall, a shipment inventory submitted by the Institute's dietary supervisor included a discrepancy in body mass distribution estimates. According to delivery logs, the expected quantity of fortified meal units was exceeded by 12 units. Annotations indicated that the surplus was a supplier overage. However, internal consumption charts showed no increased intake or redistribution. The discrepancy was noted, but not pursued. Similar deviations were recorded sporadically over the following months, never rising to formal inquiry, but consistently unresolved. In December 1837, a memorandum from the state's Institutional Accreditation Division advised facilities to submit case review summaries for all long-term residents still under procedural containment. The Brackenridge Institute filed a general compliance report with no attached names. When asked to provide clarification regarding individual case resolution, the Institute replied with a statistical overview of retention averages and transition ratios. No specific designations were mentioned. The report was accepted with a notation indicating that further specificity was pending systemic format review. By early 1838, references to creed in informal discourse had faded from circulation. Among those staff members who remained from earlier years, only 2 retained documents or verbal record, suggesting familiarity with his designation. 1, a former clerical assistant named Bartholomew Reeks, provided an unsigned interview as part of an unrelated oral history collection. In his remarks, later transcribed and archived by a state university library, Reeks stated that certain rooms were considered historically marked and not for standard assignment. He did not name creed, but referred to a system of pre-clearance thresholds, which he claimed were designed to prevent proximity exposure to what he described as residual effect corridors. The other staff member, a night steward named Edda James, retained a handwritten logbook detailing corridor rotations from 1829 to 1832. Among the notations was a sequence labeled H1-7C that appeared irregularly and without standard pacing. The sequences were brief, clustered around March and April of 1831, and always followed by full shift transfer or corridor deactivation. Her logbook, though personal, was submitted posthumously to a historical society as part of a family archive. The society catalogued the entry, but did not assign historical significance. With the gradual erasure of Creed's designation from institutional records, Room 7C ceased to exist not only in architecture, but in operational memory. Any staff onboarding materials from 1838 onward made no mention of the designation. The corridor that once connected the gallery to its annex was reportedly sealed and drywalled by early spring. Construction invoices from that period reflect material orders for patch reinforcement, but list no labor team. Visual inspection from later decades confirmed the presence of non-original plasterwork in that section, though documentation of the modification remained absent. In the final institutional year-end summary filed in December 1838, the Brackenridge Institute was credited with full procedural alignment under the revised charter. Its population metrics showed a decrease in long-term holds and a steady rotation of candidates through short-cycle programs. No unresolved intakes were listed, no missing designation codes were flagged. Under the section marked Exceptions, a blank line was drawn. By 1842, the Brackenridge Institute no longer operated under its original name. Following a statewide reassessment of private behavioral facilities, the institution was absorbed into the Mid-Commonwealth Initiative for Rehabilitation Studies, a network of regional sites tasked with standardized observation programs. Its renaming was gradual, accompanied by modest signage updates and a rebranding of internal documentation. What had once been a standalone facility with idiosyncratic methods was now described in promotional literature as a compliance node within a broader therapeutics matrix. The transformation was overseen by a new administrative board headquartered in York. Among its members were several individuals unfamiliar with the Institute's early history, and most prior case data from the pre-integration period was no longer accessible through official channels. Only a small subset of researchers retained copies of procedural documents, archived under restricted conditions by the former State Oversight Division prior to its 1840 restructuring. These archives became the basis of a quiet inquiry conducted in 1843 by a junior records officer named Phineas Lowell. Recently assigned to audit the Institute's longitudinal metrics, Lowell had been tasked with tracing irregular gaps in early outcome reporting. His approach was methodical. Starting with the intake-to-release ratios, he flagged any cohort year with retention above the standard deviation threshold. The intake year 1826, corresponding with the arrival of Silas Creed, immediately stood out. From that year, only 3 residents were listed as released, with no transfers or mortalities formally recorded. Lowell's memo to the administrative board included a chart titled Retention Cohorts Lacking Termination Indicators. Creed's designation was absent from public indices, But through cross-referencing logistical transport logs from the Brackenridge depot, Lowell identified one unit marked with the outdated code H1. The log included a date and time of departure, matching the April 1831 entry from the disposal registry, with weight and volume dimensions consistent with a Class D medical unit. His memo prompted no direct response. However, several weeks later, his access to the sealed section of the archive was temporarily suspended due to a filing system recalibration. When it was restored, two of the cross-reference sheets he had created were no longer present. He reported the discrepancy, but the missing documents were noted as non-essential working notes. A final warning from his supervisor advised him to redirect efforts toward active data consolidation rather than legacy discrepancy research. Lowell complied publicly, but continued reviewing the Institute's dormant ventilation diagrams, most of which had been overlooked in prior data transfers. One document, labeled Air Regulations Schema 1830, detailed an unlisted flow conduit feeding a sealed chamber, positioned between two structural support ribs in the northeast wing. This section, no longer present in building plans, corresponded in location and measurement to the former Room 7C. To verify the diagram's accuracy, Lowell sought out third-party surveyor records filed during the 1835 insurance inspection. Among these was a report from a subcontracted engineer, Tobias Hamrick, who had noted a redundant return cavity in the east wing with no corresponding access path. His recommendation to investigate was listed under low priority and marked pending follow-up. No indication of follow-up was found. Lowell documented these findings in a secondary memo attaching a revised schematic and the original intake discrepancies. Before submitting the report to the administrative board, he shared a copy with an external researcher affiliated with the Central Archive of Institutional History in Harrisburg. That researcher, Dr. Olive Renner, would later compile an independent case brief using Lowell's material, though it would not be formally published for nearly 2 decades. In the interim, the Brackenridge facility continued under its revised charter, with most structural anomalies masked by routine operational updates. The corridor that once led to Gallery 7 was re-bricked and painted, now serving as a records alcove for provisional intake screenings. Visitors to the facility were presented with only the western common rooms and the central presentation chamber, both refurbished with new paneling and updated flooring. No remaining staff from the Creed period were employed at this point. The Institute's final institutional reform audit, submitted in 1849, listed 0 legacy case carryovers, confirmed the full modernization of intake methodology, and included no mention of structural realignment activities. However, one section of the report, titled Unassigned Anomaly Charting, included a reference to a brief acoustic survey conducted by a visiting acoustician from Boston University. The survey, carried out during a residency workshop, recorded intermittent frequency feedback from an unmarked vertical shaft beneath the northeast storage corridor. The report concluded that the sound signatures were consistent with residual ventilation irregularities, but advised no structural concern. This mention would later be cited in internal memos requesting soundproofing installations for the lower support beams. While these installations were approved, no follow-up testing was commissioned. By 1852, the Institute had phased out all use of the Eastern Foundation Zone, citing utility redundancy. Despite official silence on the Creed case, a minor note appeared in an 1854 edition of the Rehabilitative Practices Bulletin. Authored anonymously, the entry appeared in the observations column and referred obliquely to discontinued quadrant histories and unresolved index trajectories. The piece was later removed from reprints of the edition and replaced with a general commentary on intake-to-transition ratios. In 1857, Dr. Renner submitted a sealed review manuscript to the Institutional Oversight Committee, compiling her findings based on Lowell's materials. Her report, titled Pattern Dissolution in Non-Responsive Subject Frameworks, outlined a timeline of procedural gaps, inconsistent transfer records, and omitted termination logs. Creed was named directly only once, but the designation 43B and its conversion to H1 were central to her analysis. The committee acknowledged receipt, but did not initiate investigation. As late as 1861, the institute still operated under its modern charter, though it now served primarily as a short-term evaluation center. Creed's designation was entirely absent from all remaining documents. The intake year 1826 was included only in bulk intake summaries, with no individual records accessible to public or academic inquiry. By the end of that decade, the original foundation of the East Wing had been paved over. Remaining ventilation shafts were filled with composite and capped with decorative flooring. The former central observatory tower, once used for observational analysis, was repurposed into a skylight vestibule. Structural supports bearing original intake logs were removed or covered during the renovation. Creed's name would not resurface in public discourse until the 1873 acquisition of the Harrisburg Records Annex by the Historical Association of Commonwealth Institutions. In sorting unfiled archival documents, an intern cataloging misaligned census material uncovered a misfiled intake list bearing the Creed family seal and the numerical annotation 43B. Though listed as a non-indexed intake, the document had been attached to a court-certified commitment order and bore an initial date of May 17, 1826. The document was preserved and added to the association's private collection. While not displayed, it became part of the source material for a closed circulation lecture on early private asylum frameworks. During the session, no mention of Creed's final location was made. Discussion focused instead on classification, ambiguity, and protocol drift in non-compliant residential systems. In 1879, the final administrative review of the Brackenridge site, now operating under the Commonwealth Institute for Rotational Study, concluded with its decommissioning as an active residential facility. The decision, framed around resource centralization and structural limitations, included no mention of the facility's eastern sections, which had not been referenced in official documents for over 20 years. All remaining residents were transferred to a modernized unit in Chambersburg. The Brackenridge structure remained under state ownership, but was classified as non-functional. Following the transfer, limited personnel were assigned to maintain the grounds, including one archivist, 2 clerks, and a night steward. Over the next 3 years, state archivists conducted several retrieval runs, collecting administrative records, mechanical inventories, and procedural forms. Among the last materials retrieved was a register of storage clearances, dated 1830 to 1832, whose contents had not been included in the standard residential archive. The register, bound in iron-backed leather, contained only numerical notations and spatial routing diagrams. On page 47, a corridor sequence was marked with a faded annotation, 43B hold variance, a line under review. The document was not cross-listed with intake records and did not identify its compiler. It was filed with unverified scheduling fragments and remained there, uncited, until its eventual digitization in the early 1980s. As the site transitioned into full archival storage, the lower levels of the facility were retrofitted with shelving units and preservation containers. During this process, a structural engineer noted discrepancies between the documented square footage and the physical capacity of the former Eastern Gallery. A sealed corridor, presumed bricked decades earlier, produced an irregular acoustic reading during a subfloor resonance test. When the test was repeated, the anomaly persisted. The corridor was not opened, and the test results were listed under legacy artifact inconsistencies. By 1883, vegetation had overtaken the perimeter walls, and the facility was removed from public maps. Local land surveyors occasionally referenced the structure when describing property lines, but no interior access was granted. Ownership remained with the state. No lease or external development permits were issued. The site was maintained only as a document storage depot, and by 1890, even that function had been reassigned. It was in this context that a researcher from the state university system, Dr. Carol Evers, was granted conditional access to examine legacy intake patterns from defunct private institutions. Her research centered on protocol evolution between 1820 and 1850. While examining misfiled transportation logs, she located a manifest marked Untracked Extracts Series H. The manifest listed 4 entries, H1 through H4. The first H1 carried the reference code corresponding to Creed's final designation. The location field was left blank. Dr. Evers compiled a report titled Redacted Mobility in Private Reform Circuits and submitted it for departmental review. Her findings noted a pattern of vanished designation trails, truncated intake identifiers, and systemic document divergence beginning in the early 1830s. While most cases involved vague transitions, the entry labeled H1 was unique for its abrupt cutoff and absence of related transit or terminal data. In a follow-up site visit, permitted under an expired facilities review license, Dr. Evers and her assistant conducted a visual survey of the Brackenridge property. Much of the outer structure had decayed. The eastern wing was inaccessible, obstructed by soil collapse and overgrowth. Despite this, Evers documented alignment with schematics matching pre-1831 foundation plans. She confirmed the approximate location of Room 7C, but found no entry point. Her notes described a complete sealing of the former vertical frame. Following this visit, the university declined to fund further excursions, citing diminished relevance. Dr. Evers retained her notes privately. Portions were later donated to the Society for Institutional Architecture, where they were catalogued but not circulated. The Brackenridge site was officially condemned in 1897. A demolition proposal was drafted but never executed. The structure was deemed non-interfering, and final documentation described it as inhabited only by its documents. State ownership persisted into the next century, with no change to its classification. As of the last known registry update in 1899, the following remained consistent: no termination record for Silas Creed, no discharge or external transfer, no burial documentation, and no closure of the intake classification that began in 1826. The designation 43B remains unaccounted for in all verified state systems. In administrative terms, the record is closed. The intake is not. The institution, archived. Its method, outmoded. Its memory, structural only. But the space, measured, retained, sealed. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.